All right, now that we remember quadratic equations, let's move on to the next thing, which is fractions and rationalization. Really, really important simplifying techniques that we're going to be using here. These are techniques that are going to be on your first test, second test, third test, fourth test. Every single one of your tests are going to include these techniques, so you need to be really comfortable with this. In this class, all final answers must be factored and simplified. So this is something you have to be really, really comfortable with. So on this one, it says write the following: x squared plus 8x minus 20 all over x squared plus 11x plus 10 in simplest form. So how do we do that? Well, what you need to do is you need to be able to factor, and you need to be able to factor extremely fast in this course. So for instance, on the top, it's x squared plus 8x minus 20, two numbers that multiply to be negative 20 and add to be 8. So I'm thinking 20 is 20 and 1, 2 and 10. That looks like my numbers. I'd have an x plus 10 and an x minus 2. Quite honestly, it should take you absolutely no longer than that to factor those problems. Let's look at the next one, x squared plus 11x plus 10. I need two numbers that multiply to be 10, add to be 11. Factors of 10 are 10 and 1. Looks like that would work. We'd have an x plus 10 times an x plus 1. So you need to be really, really comfortable with your factoring. Why do we want to factor? Because we notice when we factor, only when we factor can we simplify things. So only if it's multiplication can you simplify. What I see all the time is students come and look at this original problem. They see an x squared on top and x squared on bottom, and they think, okay, well, since it's on both, we can just simplify them. Absolutely not. That mathematically does not work at all. You can never simplify if it's addition or subtraction. It has to be a common factor to be able to simplify it. So here you see a factor of x plus 10. It's x plus 10 times something. And you see a factor of x plus 10 on bottom, x plus 10 times something. That is when you can simplify. So on top, what would I be left with? I'd be left with x minus 2 on top, and I'd be left with an x plus 1 on bottom. That is my final thing. Again, here I'd have tons of students sit here and say, oh, there's an x on top and there's an x on bottom. Those simplify. No, they do not. Do not oversimplify. Do not do things that are not mathematically accurate. You can only simplify when they are factors, when it is multiplication. It's something on top times something, something on bottom times something, and those two things can simplify. So only simplify with multiplication. Be very careful there. Okay. Let's remember our operations with fractions. How do you add fractions? Well, the first thing that I see here is it's a over b plus c over d. The two denominators don't match. So what do you have to do if you don't have a common denominator? You have to make a common denominator by multiplying by the missing term. So this a over b is missing a d, so they multiply both the top and bottom times d. C over D is missing a B, so they multiply both the top and bottom times B. The reason you can do this is because D over D is just a 1, and B over B is just a 1. So mathematically, you're not changing the values of anything. That allows us to have a common denominator, and then when our denominators are the same, you add them, the denominator stays the same, and then you just add the two numerators. Exact same thing with subtraction. They have to have common denominators, so multiply by whatever the missing terms are. Then you have a common denominator, subtract the numerators, keep the denominator the same. I really, really want you to be careful on this one, though. Anytime you're doing subtraction with fractions, you have to remember to distribute that negative to all of the terms. So remember to distribute the negative when you're doing subtraction. How do you multiply fractions? Well, you just multiply straight across. Numerator times numerator, denominator times denominator. I always simplify first and last. The next one looks a little weird here. It's saying, how do you divide fractions? So you might have seen it like this, a over b divided by c over d. If you remember, it's called multiplying by the reciprocal. Multiplying by the reciprocal is what you do. So to multiply by the reciprocal, the first fraction stays exactly the same. You take the second fraction and you flip it. Okay, so the second fraction flipped would be d over c, and that's how they're getting ad over bc. Okay, so another way that I remember it is keep, change, flip. That's what I've heard a lot of students say is keep, change, flip. You keep the first fraction, you change division to multiplication, you flip the second fraction. So that's all they're doing right here is they have a fraction, a over b divided by c over d. They kept the first fraction, a over b. They changed division to multiplication. They flipped the second fraction. Instead of being c over d, it's d over c. The next one here, they have a over b all over c. Well, what they do is they look at it as c over 1, because c is really c divided by 1. So that turns into a fraction over a fraction. They keep, change, flip, and they're able to get that answer right there. Number 5 says divide out common factors. So this is where you factor first and then you simplify. So if they have something in common, factor it out first and then simplify. And that's all they're saying right there. So let's look at the notes that I wrote at the bottom of the page. It says to add and subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. To multiply, multiply straight across. To divide, multiply by the reciprocal of the second fraction. That's the keep, change, flip. And then it says you can only simplify if it's a common factor to all terms in the numerator and denominator. In other words, it has to be multiplication to be able to simplify things. Has to be multiplication.